Hi, everyone. This is Daniel Strauss from the New Republic magazine. Thanks for coming today. We are very excited, if you can't tell, by having as our guest Ben Terris, who is the author of his new book, The Big Break, which is a collection of intersecting profiles and stories. The full title of the book is The Big Break, The Gamblers, Party Animals, True Believers Trying to Win in Washington While America Loses Its Mind. We are very, very excited to have Ben as the latest guest on TNR Live as part of the Run Up Live franchise. And with me today is my, as I'm trying to get off the ground, my fellow true detective, Grace Segers. True detective because the Run Up is, that's the abbreviations. So thank you for coming. We're gonna have a question and answer section later. Please buy Ben's book. And to get started, well, hi, Ben. I'm going to kick it over to Grace in a second to ask the first question, but do you have any opening remarks or anything? You told us this is your first interview first live interview of the book tour.
Yeah, I'm just excited to be here and actually get to talk about this thing that I've been thinking about for way too long now.
Yeah, well, we are very excited to have you. And I think the fun thing about this book, obviously, is about real people, but in so many ways, they just read like fictional characters because so many of them are so outlandish and doing a bunch of crazy and or interesting stuff. I just want to get started by asking who your favorite or favorites were to write about. Which characters did you really enjoy writing about? And perhaps as a corollary to that, which do you think really encapsulate what you are trying to say in this book?
Sure. Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure if I have a favorite character or not, but what I can say is that like this book, when I set out to write a book about Washington, my number one goal was to make it different than most books about Washington. The really great books that come out about Trump or about administrations, about elections, and you kind of get to see all the regular characters that are there, the names that you hear of, in the news, that are the headlines. And I really wanted to find people that weren't already being written about a lot, or at least not in the way that this book could do so. And so it was really hard to find people that were interesting, important, trying to accomplish something, while also having tensions either in their lives or tensions that were representative of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, where their story could be more than just their own story, but the story of Washington. And so I think that all the characters in this book kind of represent different parts of Washington, different tensions. And what's really exciting to me is I think their stories are fascinating, and I'm pretty sure that people reading this book, the vast majority, won't know these stories and probably won't even know the people for that matter.
Well, gotcha. How many of the stories in this book are adapted from your day job at the Post?
Well, so I'll tell everybody, who's watching here, I'm a reporter at the Washington Post. I'm in the style section, which is our feature section. And my job is to write political profiles and scene stories and kind of capture, what it feels like in American politics today, especially in Washington, but, trips covering candidates during election season, and that kind of thing. And what was the question again exactly? I started like rambling there.
How many of these are adaptations from your day job?
The answer is none, really. When I decided to write this book, I also decided I couldn't write a book while doing my job at the same time. It was just too hard. I'm not good enough at doing one thing, let alone doing two things. And so I took a lot of time off. I took almost a whole year to kind of embed with characters and report on them and write about them and have none of those stories appear in the paper. That gave me flexibility to talk to people who might not have talked to me otherwise. If they were afraid that everything that I said to them would be in the paper the next day, the next week, then they probably wouldn't tell me how they really felt about an election or how they really felt about the job they were doing, or about, oh, am I going to break up with this, this person I've been dating for a long time or not? Because if they decide to stay together and it's in the paper the next day, it's awkward. And so a lot of the drama, a lot of the things that people were going through, I was able to kind of get only because it was not going to be in the paper. So almost everything in this book, I think everything in this book is just for the book. Stuff has been excerpted since, but that is after the fact, not before.
But and yet, like, I mean, as you were writing the book, and I think after, there have been some developments with these characters, right? Like, I was very interested in the Matt Schlapp chapters, almost like I knew a spoiler because I knew what the latest news would be about the American Conservative Union chairman and CEO.
Yeah, I mean, this was, look, I like to think that I did a good job picking characters, and I think I did. But also I got lucky in a way. A lot of the people that I'd been spending time with, as I was getting close to the end of the reporting process, as I was about to have to turn in a draft, for a number of these people, really big developments happened at the end of the year. You mentioned Matt Schlapp, who I decided to spend time with this guy, not because I knew what was going to happen to him at the end of the year, but because he seemed to me like a very important Washington figure. He was a Bush White House guy, kind of an establishment Republican, white-haired early, but always like a white-haired guy, doing the establishment, traditional Republican thing in Washington. And then he became one of Donald Trump's biggest supporters. When the Access Hollywood tape broke, he was one of the first Washington people to just be like, you know what, we're going to support this guy anyway. He pretty much bet on Trump to win. And when Trump won, he had been such an early and loyal supporter that he could make, I don't know, endless amounts of money as a lobbyist, basically. And to me, that was the story of the Republican Party. A lot of people who didn't like Trump at first and then decided he was their savior. How did that happen? So he was a good story for that. But by the end of the year, he got caught in a scandal, a groping scandal. He allegedly groped a male staffer in Georgia during the Herschel Walker campaign. And that news broke at the end of the year. And I did not know that ahead of time. If I had known about an alleged groping scandal, I would have reported it, right? I wasn't going to sit on it for the purpose of a book, but it broke. Then after it broke, I learned about it and I got in touch and could kind of do some reporting on it after the fact. And so that kind of thing happened, not other groping scandals, but there were a lot of developments at the end of the year, which make for a very dramatic and exciting ending, but it was not something you could have planned for.
I want to follow up on something you just said about how people weren't necessarily willing to talk to you if it was going to show up in the paper, but clearly they were willing to talk to you knowing that it might show up in a book. Mm-hmm. So it's not that they were afraid of it becoming public, but afraid of it becoming public right now. So what do you think it says about the people that you spoke with that they were willing to share some of that stuff, but just with the delay of having it in a book?
Sure. I think some of these people would have talked to me anyway, but they would have talked to me in a different capacity, right? They wouldn't have necessarily given me as much time. And so there's a character in the book. He's one of the main characters, Sean McElwee. He is a Democratic pollster, and he is like a media hound, right? Like he loved being in the press. He was quoted all the time. I think he would have talked to me anyway. The difference between talking to him for an article and then being done with him is that's all you get. But if I spend a year reporting on him and talking to his friends and talking to people who work for him, as his story changes, I'm around for all of that. And so I get all the texture of his full story. And his story had a dramatic end to it also. I mean, I don't want to give away the entire book, as we talk about it, but a lot of it has been in the news. He had a dramatic break from his organization that he started. He was a hotshot Democratic pollster, and he kind of got on the wrong side of the people he worked for and on the people he worked with. And by the end of his story, I don't think if I had gone up to him and been like, hey, Sean, I'd like to profile you as you're going through this dramatic, turmoil in your life. But because I had been talking to him for so long, he continued talking to me because he kind of needed to tell his side of the story because he knew it was going to be told anyway. And so I think in some ways people get the best shake they're possibly going to get because the book is nuanced and complicated and gives space to their theories and who they are and what they care about and gives them room to actually, be a developed person and character. But the downside is if something horrible happens, then you're kind of stuck being in this book, even if you don't want to at the end.
But still, like some of the people you profiled, like I was green with envy about, that you talked to, like Jennifer DeCasper. And I gotta say, Ben, I do wonder, in a hypothetical universe, if so you came up to me and said, I want to profile you, Daniel, should I run, or should I just open the door and say, come on in? And that mischievous smile of yours makes me even more nervous.
Well, I mean,
But wait, but that's not, yeah, well, go on.
No, go ahead. Ask the question.
So the big question I had in reading the book, and I guess I wonder, I don't know, I kept going back to reading to think about Mark Leibovich's This Town. I'm sure you're compared to him often. And at the beginning of Leibovich's book, he says, in his author's note, he says, I love this town. I've lived here for so long and I love the characters there. And I just wonder, like, how many, there's such a, or I guess DCers like to think there's such a fascination with the people here. You've always, as a reporter, been able to see the trees and sort of step back. And it's very hard because sometimes in this town, we get so intoxicated by the traditions and the weird quirks of it. I guess I'm wondering, like, how many of these people that you wrote about are just ambitious people whose interests are conflicting, or how many, without naming names, you'd say are kind of lack some morals, and others who are very moral, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to quantify. I think that there's kind of like this big tension that goes on in Washington as a whole between, idealistic people and cynical people, or even one person that has both idealistic hopes and dreams and cynical hopes and dreams. I mean, Sean is a very good example of this. Sean McElwee, who we were just talking about. I talked to a woman who knew him better than anyone, his ex-girlfriend. They were together for 7 years. He put me in touch with her. It was not like I was seeking out dirt necessarily talking to her, but she told me that she knew him very well, and she could never tell whether he was more driven by his desire to be powerful and influential or his desire to do good. And she knew both of those were in there. And that tension is there. And I think that is one of the biggest tensions in Washington. And sure, yeah, it's a lot of ambitious people. There's ambitious people everywhere. You can go to LA and probably write a similar story of this town in LA, people searching for their big break. But Washington matters in a way that LA doesn't. Not to say that Hollywood doesn't matter, of course it does, but it matters differently here. These are people who are making legislation, who are running people for office, who are running for office themselves. The country is reflected, for better or for worse, in Washington. And I think,
here's our third True Detective. Sorry. Anyway, please continue.
No, I just think it's this kind of ambition and cynicism and idealism, and that whole kind of heady stew is really important in Washington, and I think it can make for some really rich copy, and I hope it comes across that way in the book.
Grace?
Yes, I'm sorry. My cat Pumpkin just walked across the camera, as he is wont to do. So sorry about that. But this is kind of perhaps a silly question, but Daniel put in our question doc, I think it's a great question.
You must know.
He once asked Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, the newest Republican presidential candidate, if he was a virgin. What was that like?
Yeah, well, that was a long time ago, but yes, it's something that happened. In 2012, I was a reporter at National Journal, relatively new to Washington, and my job was to profile members of Congress mostly. And he was an interesting member of Congress, and it was one of my first kind of big magazine stories. And I went deep on reading about Tim Scott and where he came from and what he was all about. And in my reporting, I found an article from years back, a local paper in Charleston, where he's from, that talked about this young 30-year-old legislator who would go to high schools and colleges and preach the importance of abstinence. He was a religious guy, and he talked about his own personal story. He said, I'm not a married guy, and abstinence is hard, trust me, I know, but it's important, and I think it really matters. And when I interviewed him, he was still an unmarried guy, and it sort of felt like fair game. It was really awkward. And so beforehand, I kind of wrote out a whole script because I didn't want to just go and be like, hey, like, well, while we're here, can I just ask you, like, you ever been laid before? Like, that's a weird thing to ask a congressman or anyone really. And so I kind of laid out this whole script, and I talked, I let him know I'd done my homework, and I read about this and that, and I cited the paper, and I said, this was a virtue that you adhered to, as a 30-year-old. Is that a virtue that you still adhere to today? So it was a way to ask that question without using the words. And he didn't, the script didn't help. He did not like the question regardless. And he said something like, I'm not going to talk about my sex life with Ben Terris or anyone else for that matter. And then he stood up and weirdly said, I got to go potty, which was weird to hear. And then he went to the bathroom. Yeah, it was weird. And then I looked at his like comms person who was there, and he kind of gave me one of these like Jim Halperin from The Office looks, like, I don't know. And then he came back and he basically said, look, I maybe haven't been as good at adhering to that virtue as I'd have liked. I might still preach the importance of abstinence, but I wouldn't tell my personal story anymore. And I was like, okay, well, I guess he got laid.
Whoa.
Great.
How do you do that, Ben? This is one of the things I wonder about. Like, again, just because being in DC so long, you get into this insider thing. How do you just like remain willing and able to ask like the elephant in the room or the uncomfortable question or something like that, and not worry about, oh, then this person won't talk to me or if I like chisel this down a bit, maybe I will get more access or something like that?
Yeah. Well, I have the kind of blessing of having a job where I don't need people to talk to me again. Like if Tim Scott never talked to me again, then I would have found other people to write about. But weirdly, like I wrote that profile, and then a few years later, I went to the Washington Post, and I went and wrote another profile of him. We went to a Goodwill together, and he went undercover. He was, I think, a senator at that point. Yeah, he was a senator. He put on like a ball cap and jeans and went to a Goodwill and like volunteered, and nobody knew who he was. And it was his way of like collecting stories. And he let me hang around for that. And I wrote another profile of him later when he was like a big deal in the Trump years, where I wrote a magazine piece for the Washington Post, and he talked to me for that. And I think it kind of gets back to your other question that you had before. It's like, why don't people just run away when you come? I think part of the answer is like, I think I really am fair to the people I write about. They're not going to love everything. He did not like that the story included stuff about his alleged virginity, the first story, but I didn't lead with it. I didn't make it the whole story. I didn't like write it like a tabloid. I tried to include it in the story in a way that felt fair. And I think people respect that, even if they don't always like it. And sometimes the alternative is, if they don't give me access, I write about them anyway, and then they don't have any ability to kind of tell their side of the story as much as they'd like. So I think that is partly why. And how do I do it? I don't know. I think I just I'm so afraid of like messing up. I'm so afraid of messing stuff up that I'm like, if I don't do this and if I don't do it right, I'm going to go home and I'm going to hate myself. So I just kind of remove myself from the situation and just ask the questions that I feel like I need to ask.
Gotcha. So I have to ask you as a follow-up then, are you surprised that Scott is now running for president? I mean, do you think is this an evolution at all? Like, and I guess this sort of hits a larger point here, which is like, how many members of Congress would you like? The joke is every member of Congress looks in the mirror and sees a future president. Do you think that's true? Is that true with Scott? Like, I didn't know you had a PhD in Tim Scott, but I think I would say that now.
Yeah, I don't know about
profiles of one figure is a lot.
A master's. I have a master's.
Master's. I have a PhD.
Am I surprised? No, not really. I mean, he's an ambitious and talented politician, right? And do I think he's going to win? Like, I don't know. I wouldn't make predictions.
Well, do you think he thinks he's going to win? That's like another thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Who knows? I bet he is very confident in his abilities. And I think that he thinks something good will come from this. And could that be president? Sure, he probably thinks so. I mean, he's lived a life where he's accomplished things that everybody told him he could never accomplish. It's been very impressive. He's very religious. He probably feels called to this in one way or another. And and he can always say, look, I'm the spiritual core of this party right now, and we need somebody like me out there to bring down the temperature, and there's value in that. But it's not really surprising to me, because the guy's, he's been moving up forever, and eventually you move up high enough and, oh, there's the White House, right? Like, there's not that many things to look for anymore.
To move on a bit, did you learn anything from writing this book about politics or about people generally that surprised you? Did you come away with anything new from this?
I don't know, yes, I'm sure, and lots of big themes, but the thing that pops into my mind first when you ask that is what's something I learned is I learned about political gambling. I didn't know that was a thing, and it turns out it's a really big thing where people will place bets with their friends, but also online, on usually using a website called Predict It, or using cryptocurrency exchanges, where you can bet on political outcomes and make thousands of dollars on who's going to win an election in a Seattle mayor's race, or the presidential election, or primaries. You can bet on whether legislation is going to pass or not. When I first learned about this, I learned about it while going to these poker nights at Sean McElwee's house. He would talk about his betting, which was shocking to me that a pollster would talk about his betting, including betting against and for clients that were his clients. That was shocking. But I was also kind of just shocked that everyone around the table was like, oh yeah, like I know someone betting on this or that, and some people were betting themselves, and there's kind of a whole culture of it. And like, I'm a pretty cynical, a jaded Washington watcher, but that to me was just like, really? Like, A, you're doing that, and B, you're talking about it in front of a journalist? That was surprising to me. And I think, not to draw too strong a connection to Donald Trump or anything like that, but there's always been some shamelessness in Washington. And I think I was kind of just surprised by the ways in which it grew in recent years, and the places you'd find it that you wouldn't necessarily expect to find it. That felt pretty cynical to me.
So what I found, I mean, that's a good segue to my next question. What I found really unique about your book and I love reading profiles. I hate writing them. I love reading them. Is that you were doing this at this moment where a lot of Washington, D.C., there's sort of a collective soul searching post-Trump. And it very much feels like, I mean, I joke about this more than like, if you watch The West Wing or something now, post-Trump, like an entire episode will be, oh no, a press release was released and it is worded perfectly, but who released the press release? And everyone freaks out and they get 45 minutes out of that. Now it's like, as long as, we're not at war with North Korea, things are fine. I wonder if there's anything more, without spoiling, some of the ends of the book, about your conclusion about how DC has changed and how has it not.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of the main questions I was setting out to write about was, how much did Trump change this place, right? Everybody was paying attention during the Trump years, and they saw the ways in which he, smashed norms and, got rid of guardrails. And it was really unclear whether after he left, if he was going to leave this place kind of destroyed, or if he was going to, leave it basically the same. The way I was thinking about it is like, it's a swamp. I was thinking about that Simpsons reference where the toxic waste goes into a swamp, and there's all these creatures there, and they get third eyes and stuff. They're all the same creatures in Washington, but like it's a little bit toxic now, a little bit more toxic, a little bit like everything could grow to greater proportions. And so it's like a weirder place than it's ever been. But I don't know if he fundamentally changed every part of it. Like the same kinds of people are doing the same kinds of things. They're just doing it in like kind of grosser ways.
Yeah, I mean, it does, as primarily a campaign reporter, it does feel like, I don't know, the processes of the campaign trail, or even the reporting about like, what's a big event, like X strategist was sent in to fix Y race, it just seems so much less inconsequential than it used to be.
Yeah, and so I mean, I'd like to think that this book has got some kind of Veep-like qualities to it, right? I think that if people read it, I hope that they are in for a ride, a romp, that they'll laugh sometimes, but also they'll like, after they laugh at some of the crazy things that are in the book, also sort of be like, ew, like this is horrible. Like, are things bad? And I think it can be funny, and if you don't laugh, you'll cry, kind of a situation. But it is a bleaker time than when This Town came out, or when Veep came out, or when West Wing came out. Everything does feel very dire. And so the big break, the title is, both about the country that went through a big break, which is, the Trump years and before, but also about all the people who come to Washington, pioneers kind of searching for their big break in this new frontier. And a lot of them learned lessons from Donald Trump, and they tried to act like him in certain ways, thinking that this is the way to do things here, and it could get them to a certain place, but also could ultimately, could sink them. And so I think the answer is it did change Washington in a lot of ways, and it revealed a lot about Washington.
Do you think, because we sort of had a full presidential campaign cycle and a half since Trump, do you think this presidential cycle is going to be different, or does that change extend to 2024?
In what way? What do you mean? Is it?
Every presidential campaign cycle is different. Like the last few have been very different because of Twitter and just sort of the tools people use. But do you think Trump, or the way that DC has changed, is going to extend to sort of the processes that we see on the presidential campaign trail? I don't know if I'm asking that.
Yeah, I think every election learns from the last election. And so there definitely will be lessons that people running campaigns will try to take from, the last two elections. It's always unclear until after the election is over which of these lessons is actually a good lesson, right? Is it good to be like Donald Trump and to never back down, and all press is good press, and be in the news all the time and be scandalous and say offensive things, knowing that you're going to suck up all the attention, and having all the attention means that you are the front runner? Maybe, or maybe only Donald Trump can get away with it, and anyone else who tries is going to look like a fool. So it's kind of hard to know.
So I think kind of building on that question from Daniel, though, I know you say it's hard to know what things are going to look like, but where we are right now, do you think that there is a storyline that people may be missing going into 2024 that we should be paying attention to, but aren't in this post-Trump / not post-Trump era?
No, I don't know. I don't know what everybody pays attention to be honest. We can be in a bubble in Washington ourselves, and it's hard to know exactly what the rest of the country is paying attention to. I think a lot of the things that are getting coverage are getting the right coverage. Doesn't mean we know how it's going to play out. There's possible indictments looming. There's, there's new candidates that are coming in that may or may not have a chance. You got to just kind of cover the main stories as they reveal themselves, and then when it ultimately matters in a big way, you're around for it, right? Like, we can't pretend that these guardrails that have kind of come back, these legal proceedings aren't going to possibly be important, but we also can't know exactly how people respond to them.
Turning away from your book, just to ask your opinion as an observer of the human condition, I am interested to know if you find any particular candidate in 2024 that has announced to be particularly interesting or worthy of further discussion.
It's hard for me to find anyone interesting at this point. I feel like we're kind of going into an election that feels like we've seen this all before. We've seen these people before. We know what they're like. I almost feel like, why don't we just have everybody vote right now? What's the difference? But I do think that what's interesting is maybe paying attention to people, not because they will be interesting in this election, but because you might get a sense of who the bench is in future elections, right? If it just ends up being Donald Trump and Joe Biden again, we kind of know their story. But there'll be people who speak on behalf of them, and maybe you're going to say, oh, like, this is the person that could be the next, a next presidential candidate or next senator somewhere. I don't know who those people are yet because we haven't really got deep into the campaign, but those are the people I'll be paying attention to.
Oh, Ben, all this talk about like how DC has changed and sort of in a darker way, I guess I think authors are asked this too much, but count me as someone who will ask this. Like, do you find yourself getting jaded on Washington? Do you think there's sort of hope for functionality in the next few years or decades in this town, or sort of a return to like an era of bipartisanship?
I don't know about an era of bipartisanship or not, but I can tell you that like a lot of people come to Washington specifically to do good. I mean, there's this idea of Washington that it is purely filled with swamp things and cynical creatures, and they get a lot of attention because they're important, and I give them attention in the book. I'm not saying that they aren't important, but the book also spends time. I spend time in for this book with a lot of people who are just here to do the work, and I don't know. I find that kind of inspiring. There's a lot of people who go to Capitol Hill and they put in long hours and they work really hard on legislation because it matters to them. They get paid nothing. They get treated like garbage, and they still do this work. I'm not inspired by the way that they're treated. And one of the things that's in the book is kind of this attempt by people who work on the Hill. One person I talked to in the book refers to them as the subaltern, the kind of below the surface people who aren't part of the hierarchy, the staffers, the workers, cafeteria workers, people who are unionizing and trying to change Washington's, core. And I think there's a lot of good that can come from people who are just trying to do good stuff. And so I don't know. I am jaded and cynical about a lot of Washington, but also in reporting this book, there's a lot of stuff that gave me hope. Absolutely.
We've got a few questions now, Ben. Let's see. So one question was what I basically just asked. Here's a good one. One question is, does your book find similarities between the Trumper Republicans and the Democrats or independents, or where are the weirder situations centered? Which party's the weirder one right now?
Well, I mean, I think the Republican Party is weirder. Absolutely. I mean, look, I don't want to say there's an equivalency between the two parties. There's nothing like what's happening on the Democratic Party side as what happens on the Republican Party side. I mean, this kind of pure loyalty to Trump, even as he's going through these, legal challenges, even in the wake of the Access Hollywood tape in 2016. I mean, this kind of devotion to him that has basically stayed high. I mean, there's been dips. I find very, very weird. But I see how it happens. I mean, I spent time with people, and really it does feel like a lot of folks are just making a bet on what they think is going to make them influential. And sometimes people do that because they want to make change. Oh, I can ride this candidate's victory and then work on a legislation that I really care about. But a lot of people are just doing it because they can make money and they can be influential. They can whisper to the president. They can get new clients. That happens on both sides for sure. But the connection to Trump definitely feels weirder to me than what I see on the Democratic side.
Why do they stick with Trump? I feel like we don't ask that enough. It's always, are they going to stick with it? But why? Why now? Like, I would still say he is the front runner for the Republican nomination still, amidst these legal troubles, amidst him saying, for millions of years, celebrities have been able to grab people in their genital areas.
I mean, I think he's got the base loves him. That's not going to change. The more he gets attacked, the more that this maybe 25 to 35% of the country is going to support him no matter what, and that's a big number in primary politics. And then in Washington, I think people just kind of are a bunch of weathermen watching which way the wind blows on that, and they see, okay, well, if he's going to be the front runner throughout, then yeah, I'm not going to start attacking him on TV. I'm not going to start disinviting him to CPAC or whatever. Of course they're gonna connect with him because they think he's gonna win, and that's their meal ticket.
Man, a lot of these stories, a lot of this is also sort of about ambition overriding common sense or morals in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in particular too when you think about loyalty to Trump overall. And as someone who covers Congress and who was at the Capitol on January 6th, there was something incredibly jarring about coming back to a desecrated, literally desecrated Capitol and having it be 1 a.m. and having all of these Republicans making speeches about how the election is illegitimate and actually we do need to overturn it, which is basically what the insurrectionists were trying to do. The House members and few Senate members were just trying to do it in a more legal way. But something that I often wrestle with is how much do people believe what they're saying versus what you were talking about, that's ambition, that's their meal ticket. And I'd be interested to know the sort of balance of true believers to sort of venal, ambitious politicians or actors. Which do you find more common in your reporting?
I mean, like I was saying about Sean before, I think it is sort of, there's some of both, obviously, in everybody. I think a lot of times people kind of join up with the team, their team, and they do it for maybe, I don't know, business reasons or just tribal reasons. But then once you're there, I think it's kind of easy to start truly believing some of these things, right? Once you're the one getting attacked for the beliefs that you have put out on television, once, you know, it seems like the media is always writing negative stories about the candidate that you are now on record saying that you support, it probably feels personal to a lot of people. And I think that can, you know, it can curdle inside people and become true feelings. And so I think a lot of people maybe went into Trump's White House because they were like, yeah, it's the White House and I need to be an adult in the room. And then they started feeling attacked all the time. When I wrote a profile of Kellyanne Conway and her husband, George, George famously despised and despises Trump. Kellyanne, big supporter. He kind of talked.
Aren't they divorced now?
They are either divorcing or divorced. Yeah. And he talked to me about this and said that it was sort of hard for him to be fully mad at Kellyanne about this because he felt like she had fallen into a cult. Like she had gotten there. She's as cynical as anybody else in Washington. But then she had this bunker mentality where all of a sudden her team was being attacked and it made her dig in. And then it became a true thing for her. Maybe also she started to believe, you know, in Trump as a, I don't know, a generational talent. I have no idea. But at least George believed that something that started out one way could turn into something else. I think there's a lot of that in Washington.
Well, on a brighter note, you also have a nose for finding the funny. And there are definitely moments in this book also, Ben, where I wanted to know your response in the moment. There's a moment, for instance, where Senator John Tester is peeing and you get out of a car with his press person. The press person says that his penis is off the record or something like that.
Yeah.
There are moments I found, I'm sure all of us reporters have found in our day-to-day where a press person will be like, this is off the record, and I'll be thinking, how would that even be on the record or something? I mean, here it was, but like, what was your response in that moment, and how do you,
Yeah, so the way that happened was I was writing a profile of Senator John Tester, who in addition to being a, you know, crucial Democratic senator from Montana in a red state, he's also a working farmer. And so I spent a day with him on a tractor on his organic pea field. And at one point he jumped out of the tractor and I thought he was going to pick rock. That was something he would do, is he'd grab rocks that were on the ground and, you know, put them in the tractor so it wouldn't mess up his machinery. So I walked around to see what was going on and he was just peeing right there in my direction. And I guess by the time I got off the tractor a few hours later, when the press person drove up in his Subaru to greet us, he asked me, can the senator's penis please be off the record? Which I, in real time, laughed at because it was the funniest thing I ever heard and thought maybe this could be a memoir title someday. But instead, it's just a little detail in this book filled with details.
Was there any other detail in the book that really made you laugh?
Yeah, lots. I mean, honestly, I laughed my way through lots of this book. I don't know. One thing that I just found surreal and kind of funny was spending time with Frank Luntz, the Republican pollster. I kind of wanted to spend a little bit of time with him because so many of my characters were relatively new to Washington with their futures in front of them. And Frank Luntz was kind of on the other side of that. He'd made his fortune. He'd been a big deal. And now people didn't really care about him as much. And I went out to his house in Virginia that he was moving out of because nobody would visit him anymore. And it was like he decorated that place like an overgrown child, basically. Baseball cards filled his kitchen cabinets. He had a statue of Ronald McDonald at one point, Terminator statue. He had the original Bob's Big Boy Burger statue out by his pool. And it was pretty hard to keep a straight face getting the tour of his house. That honestly, like if I was 13 and I had a dream house, it's like either Big, Tom Hanks and Big, or Frank Luntz's house. That's, those are two ways to live.
Grace?
Yeah. Sometimes I think about how who a reporter is factors into sort of the story that they get or the things that they see. And now I'm just really curious as to whether John Tester would pee in front of a woman reporter. Like, did he feel comfortable with that because you were a dude? Or do you think like...
I don't think he thought I was coming around the corner. I don't think it was, but probably it was less awkward for him that I was not a woman. Yeah, I think that's probably fair to say.
Yeah.
So Ben, you get these questions often. Who do you want to profile next? Who intrigues you? I think we sort of hit on that a little bit before, but I want to just ask you point blank here.
I don't know. I have some stories in the works. I'd love to talk about them, but then I would get yelled at by my bosses. A couple of stories that I'm very excited about. One that I think will come out on Thursday. I'll send you guys the link. You can tweet it out or whatever if you want. As for beyond that, it's hard to think too far in advance. I sort of just do one story at a time. But I really, again, like what's been exciting about this book is finding people behind the people, not just the obvious ones. And so I always have this tension in the job, which is like, do I write about someone that everyone knows about in a way that nobody expects? That's one part of the job. And the other is, can I write about somebody that almost nobody knows about? And so I'm always looking for both of those. So
it seems like that would be a big gamble, right? Like there's either sort of an intrinsic or built-in audience, or there's no built-in audience, but it might be bigger once you delve deeper into someone.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's sort of the gamble I've taken with this book, right? I mean, there are people that, big name people throughout this book, but the main characters are the real Washington people. It's like being inside the rooms where people who work in Washington speak openly and candidly about their lives and about, their hopes and dreams and about their, plans for the election. And I think that's more interesting in a way than getting big named senators to give me interviews. I'd rather be around the people that make it work. I kind of thought about it like as if Thank You for Smoking were real, right? I mean, that book, the characters in that book they're just so rich. It's made up. I mean, that helps. They're lobbyists. They're working for tobacco and for the NRA or whatever the equivalent of the NRA is in that book and movie for that matter. And I love that stuff because it's like, these are actual people going through real things, and then their lives, the consequences are much bigger than them.
How would you profile Nick Naylor? What would be the opening scene?
Oh God, I don't know. Probably however it was done in the book. I mean, that book was really fun.
I would want to like start with the what is it, the Council of Death, and what's his name puts cheese on his pie and eats it. And one of the
American flag or whatever.
Yeah, and he's like, it's American.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a slight tangent, and then I will ask a real question. But I never read the book. I just saw the movie, and it includes one of my absolutely least favorite tropes, which is that the female journalist sleeps with her source. And is that?
Yeah. No, the book does not hold up well in that way. Like, it is definitely written of an era. It is super misogynistic and probably worse in the book than it was in the movie, to be honest. So it's not perfect. But all I meant by that, please know that there's no female journalist sleeping with anybody in this book. Is that like, seeing people behind the people that like in their real human moments, I think art is exciting and dramatic, but also important.
That does bring me to sort of a process question. How did you find writing this book? Did you approach it like writing a bunch of profiles and then just squishing them together, or how is it different from your day job?
Yeah, it was so hard, honestly, because all I've done really in my life is write articles. And I knew pretty early on that a book is not just a bunch of articles smushed together. It can be. You could do a collection of profiles, and it would have been easier if what I did was just a collection of profiles. But I really wanted this to feel of a piece woven together, even though not everybody meets everybody, even though not everybody's story connects. And so it was a lot harder than writing, well, let's see, how many articles would it have been? Probably 40 articles or something all mushed together. It was harder than that, because a lot of the work is in the thread that stitches everything together, which, in an article, you just write an introduction and a middle and then an end, and then you're gone. This, everything I kind of had to make sure felt like it fit together. It was hard.
I think we are just about out of time, Ben. I
want to ask one more question.
Oh yeah, okay. I have one more also.
Okay, then you go first, because mine's silly.
So it's funny. I interviewed another author a little while ago, David Gran, who has written politics stories, but doesn't anymore. And I've been going back to his old New Yorker articles, and I read an article he did of Mark Halperin, a profile of him in like 2004. And there were like, it's an experience reading a profile decades later, especially of someone who turns out to be a serial sexual harasser, and there's no mention of that in the profile. I guess I wonder, like, is there some profile you've written that aged really well? And do you ever think about like how, I mean, I don't think many people know or read this Mark Halperin profile, and I was very shocked to see like the note was very influential and how influential it was at the time and how influential newsletters are now. So like, are there any similarities to something you've written a long time ago, or differences?
Well, I mean, if you asked, are there articles that hold up really well? I try not to read my old stuff too much because I would cringe my way through it. But occasionally there's a piece of mine that pops up like 10 years ago, you published this on my Facebook, and I'll look at it. And one that was really fun that I did was the first big story I did at National Journal was going hog hunting with the most conservative member of Congress based on National Journal's rankings. And I used him. He was a guy that nobody had heard of, but I used him to kind of explain the Tea Party a little bit and try to see a guy in their natural habitat, so to speak. And he took me hunting, and I blasted my forehead with the scope. It came back, and I went to the emergency room, and it was an experience. But also reading it, I was like, oh yeah, I do feel like I got that moment. It doesn't always go that way. I have a profile that I wrote, years ago about Benny Johnson, the serial plagiarist from BuzzFeed, was trying to have his his comeback. And I wrote a story about him that I thought was very damning about him. And it was sort of him, and the whole story was him telling me a bunch of stories, but by the time you get to the end, it turns out he made them up, and I kind of reveal him to be telling me lies. It was kind of subtle. Not everybody picked up on that. Some people thought it was too fluffy at the time. But the real problem is he's a different person now than he was then, at least, in the public. He's kind of become very reactionary, and he's, very Trumpy. And the way that he carries himself, it's like none of that stuff is in that piece, because there was only maybe hints of it that I maybe could have caught on to better. But it just doesn't stand the test of time, because at that moment he was one thing, and this moment he's another thing. And I don't even know why I'm mentioning it now, because I'd rather nobody read it. You know what I mean?
Well, I will because I appreciate you taking the time so much, I will not Google that profile.
No, I had one more question, just out of my own interest. aside from your own book, what are your favorite political books?
Well, I do love This Town. I mean, I think that book really is great. It captures a moment. It's super fun. Mark Leibovich is an incredibly lively writer. He makes it seem effortless. I have the job at the Washington Post that he once had, so I pretty much have been looking up to the work he does all the time. It's another one of these books that, like, it's a different era. It is a different Washington that he's covering, which is why I feel like this book, in a way, really needed to be written. If there wasn't another take on what it's like to be in Washington, that would sort of be the last book about it. And so he has a new book that came out called Thank You for Your Servitude, which is about Republicans, and it's different than This Town. But his books, I think, are always great.
Can I just ask a follow-up question based on that? We have a question from one of the audience members. I'll read it out loud. I'm turning 75 soon. Do you in this Trump era have hope of a greater dignity in politics in America once he fades away?
Well, first of all, happy birthday. Happy almost birthday. Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think... I don't think that this has to be permanent. I mean, I don't think that it happens right away. It's not like, someone loses an election and then every single thing that made this election, the election that it was, goes away. Donald Trump lost the last election. It's not like we are in a completely different place because of it, but we are in a different place. It is different now than if he had won. If he loses again, or in years go by and there's new leaders in the party, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this country's been through plenty of things. The person having his birthday, 75 years, I'm sure there's been lots of ups and downs in this country that felt impossible to overcome, and we've overcome them and then fallen deeper and then overcome them again. I've hoped for that.
I think that is a good place to stop. That's as hopeful and optimistic I think we got today. Ben, thank you so much. I will buy you a beer next time we go up to Tacoma Brewing. It's on me. And thanks to everyone for watching today. Our TNR Live. As a reminder, this is part of the Run-Up newsletter franchise. Comes out every Thursday. We are very excited that we have streamlined the sign-up process, so you can go to the front page of the website and sign up. And we are also always in the market for entrants in our Pet of the Week contest. So if you have a good-looking pooch or a bad-looking cat, please send them our way. Thanks so much, everyone, today, and until next time.